Greetings and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory, tonight joined by our special guest, Dr. Peter Chan. Now, like most doctors, they often enter the medical profession to help improve the health and well-being of their patients. And this is certainly true of our guest tonight, Dr. Peter Chan, who spent the last 12 years as a doctor focused on improving the overall health and well-being of his patients. However, during his time as a GP, he's been exposed to a world of health politics and a reductionist and protocol-driven approach to healthcare, which he believes is at best ineffective and at worst detrimental to the overall well-being of patients. Now, this has reached new lows over the course of the past 2 years, where people continue to suffer terribly through appalling public health management and diabolical access to health and care services. Now, like many others, Dr. Chan could never imagined how our society could regress so rapidly as it has done in 2020 and 2021, where a series of unethical and incomprehensible policies and mandates have degraded our society into a world of suffering and chaos. Dr. Chan believes that now is not the time to stay low and keep out of trouble. Now is the time to stand up and fight for what we treasure before it's too late. I'm excited to bring Dr. Chan to the show tonight to talk about what can be learned from the struggles on the front line over the past 2 years, how healthcare services can be improved in the future, and how a holistic approach to healthcare can treat the root cause of illness and improve well-being, and how you can implement some of the principles of functional medicine to help you stay well both now and into the future. Dr. Peter Chan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Dan, and I'm really grateful that you give me the airtime and platform to perhaps rant first. But the important thing is to get the message out in that there's hope, and that we must concentrate on what's needed to ensure our well-being during this really challenging time, and also, and beyond that, really, because I believe that actually to cope with the coming world and so on, we do need to be in the position where that we are well. And so yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
My pleasure. So tell me, first of all, your observation of some of the struggles that we've witnessed over the last couple of years. What have been your observations from the front lines?
Well, I suppose the first observation is that there's incredible amounts of unethical and it's just incomprehensible behavior over the past 2 years. And so when I remember that when the kind of initial pandemic was emerging, there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and then fair enough, because we didn't have the information at the time. So it's reasonable to do some planning and so on. But some of the things that was filtered down was very odd and so on. So coroner was saying to us, writing to GPs at the front line to say, look, we're gonna streamline the inquest and so on, and basically that if you suspect and so on, just put COVID down. And at that stage, we didn't really quite realize what that meant. Basically, what that meant is that everything's streamlined, no postmortem, no study of a novel disease, so we can learn and sort of develop treatment and so on. That was quite unusual, really. Certainly, as a clinician, I couldn't understand why that was the case. Surely, that if there's something so deadly coming our way, we want to learn about it so we can exploit the weaknesses and develop treatment and so on. That makes sense to me. Anyway, but then again, what do I know? I'm only a GP. I work on general principle and common sense. And then the next thing that didn't really make sense at the time is that just before the lockdown, Public Health England published the fact that SARS-CoV-2 was not a high consequence infectious disease, but yet the behavior after that is boom, lockdown, and suddenly the whole raft of policies that come into place was completely beyond comprehension. So a lot of elderly people that was infected was decanted back into the community care home and nursing home in a really poorly supported, inadequate equipment, inadequate support and so on, to create capacity within the hospital for the same cohort. Now, call me stupid, but I just can't see for the life of me what that was about. Okay, because we've been through many flu seasons, flu epidemics, and so on. I qualified as a GP back in 2009. So in 12 years, I've seen good old 3 really bad flu epidemics, and so on. The principle is the principle during those times is that during epidemics and so on, you concentrate your resources on those vulnerable, protect them. Okay, And then, we never really shut down. We just carried on. The health service struggled, and then more people came in, and through goodwill and gesture, we coped, despite despite all this, I suppose, capacity reduction policy over the years. We coped. But 2020 was completely different. 2020, basically, we did the completely opposite. We basically left all those vulnerable to their own devices, early palliative care. And that's very, very unethical in my view, because what I do is I go into care homes, I make sure that everything can be done early is done, rather than say, oh, well, there's no lot we can do. And at the same time, around about that time, and us GPs were informed that, by the way, you can't go in and see them, by the way. You have to do everything by video. I mean, how on earth are you going to see them, see this cohort of really complex patients? We're not talking about people, who's got one or two conditions. These are people who is likely to be late 70s and 80s and beyond with 2 or 3 or more conditions, with more than, sometimes medication in a list of 10s and 20s.
Indeed.
These are the people that requires lots of intervention. And so in the past, we used to say we spend about 80% of our resources on 5% of the population. They were it. They were the 5%. And suddenly, 2020, don't worry about them. Just let them go. And it was really heartbreaking, Dan. I can't stress how heartbreaking it was. GPs were so scared to do anything at all. And then not many people dare to visit. And I was one of the few that's what took the risk, and we dared to visit and so on. And by the time we got to lots of these elderly people and vulnerable people in care homes and so on, it was really too late. All care was withdrawn, palliative care was put into place. So just in case end-of-life drugs were put in place. And what can I do? There's not a lot you can do except hold their hands and hoping that the suffering they're not suffering too much. And that broke my heart. That was the trigger point where I thought, do you know what? We're doing this completely the wrong way around. We are killing people unnecessarily. And that really, really got to me. I got so pissed off. Excuse to swear, by the way. I was so heartbreaking. It's unconscionable. And at the same time, in practice and in out of hours and so on, it was empty for weeks and weeks. I work as a freelance, so I was helping out with a good friend's practice and so on. So I sat there for weeks. I usually go through 20, 25 patients in a morning, and plus a lot of results and so on. I sat there taking 2 or 3 calls per morning. It was so quiet that let me go, Dan.
Wow.
Okay. And then what does that mean? What that meant at the time that we literally have reallocated all the resources unnecessarily. We deflected all the important work unnecessarily. Okay. And then you wonder why we're in this pickle now. 6 million on the waiting list for significant conditions. I mean, how can anyone justify that? How can anyone, in the right frame of mind in health service think that's conscionable things to do?
Well, it's closing in on 10% of the entire UK population in a hospital waiting list. It's that severe now. It's insane.
It's horrendous. It's horrendous. And at the same time, just funds will seem very different group and so on. It's actually quite bizarre how SARS-CoV-2 worked out, really, Dan. I mean, in the elderly and so on, it's pretty fatal, really, with the case fatality rate, in the 20s and 30s and so on. But anyone after that is almost like nothing happened. In the young people, nothing happened. In children, nothing happened. Almost like a protective infection. They behave so mild. It's like, oh, that so and so kid has got tested positive and so on. So what happened to him? Nothing at all. And then in slightly a mature middle age group and so on, where unless you have other really significant health conditions, for example diabetes, obesity, and other neurological conditions and so on, and they actually just behave like a bad flu. Oh yeah, that wasn't great, but nothing happened to them. And that was most baffling, because this is what we see on the front line, and then what's on the news? Case rate keep on going up, death rate keep on going up, but not in context. Basically all this death rate, not in context, what does it actually mean?
Well, this is the point, and you mentioned a point earlier on about the how you've been through many other epidemics, three major flu epidemics, and of course, most of us have become kind of couch spectators of the kind of the science and the medical practices that have followed. Therefore, many of us don't have a background understanding of how the healthcare service prepares for a winter flu season, for instance. But obviously, through the course of the work here on the Pandemic Podcast, I've had access to all kinds of the flu influenza preparation materials. The types of documentation that outlines how to prepare and manage a major respiratory viral outbreak. And many of those policies and protocols just simply haven't applied. We've just, this unprecedented territory of lockdowns, which you have to question, where did that idea come from, and how does it continue, despite its vast flaws as a policy, continues to be part of the dialogue. But then more broadly, you've got the conversation. I remember the Great Barrington Declaration came forward, and I thought, thank goodness, there's some common sense. So this was October last year, with epidemiologists from Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, some of the most prestigious educational institutions on earth, highly regarded professors, and the whole thing was talking about focused protection, which means that policy was slandered. It was publicly demonized. And it's just come out in the last week that Anthony Fauci in America and Francis Collins arranged for that to be, well, I've actually got the email here. It says there needs to be a quick and devastating public takedown of its premises, which is just shocking. Yeah. So it shocks me that so many of the medical profession who have, like yourself, been through flu season and witnessed how to manage a seasonal epidemic, the doctors simply lost their way. What went on? Why do you think so many people have kind of gone along with these unusual protocols without question?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Dan. I mean, we always know that when politics play medicine, people come to harm and people die, and so on. So, and then last 2 years certainly been but mostly and mainly political driven arena in terms of policies rather than health. And then with the health service so under control of the central control is unbelievable, really. I mean, if I just describe to you what the funding structure is like for primary care, okay, so basically that the Department of Health is what funnel the money down to NHS England. NHS England is what divvy out the money. And then for primary care, it goes to a group called a CCG, Clinical Commissioning Group. And from there, they start to pay practices. Okay, so they pay practice per head, per year to do the work. And they also incentivize practices to take on additional work, for example, preventative work and other important work. That kind of work is called QOF, Quality Outcome Framework. And then they also incentivize practice to do enhancement work, enhanced services. So things like a vaccination program, minor surgery, and so on and so forth. So every single thing that we do in primary care is linked to a payment, and so on. So let's say that tomorrow, if they change the QOF criteria, and suddenly every practice is there panicking, going, "Oh my God, what are we going to do to achieve the maximum income?" and so on. So it's no longer about, the people don't think about, oh, by the way, is that actually a good idea what we're doing here? It's more of a quick, we need to work out our KPI ratio, They bring in the resources, so we achieve that. And then without the funding, because certainly without governmental funding, health service will simply fall apart, and so on. So if you understand that relationship and so on, you certainly understand. It'll be easier to understand why so many clinicians, would be under so much threat in terms of their survival, in terms of their career, businesses, and so on. They simply can't extract themselves from the structure. And at the same time, that's in the initial part of the pandemic. Well, I shouldn't really use the word pandemic, really. That's not scientifically, well, that's not clinically true. But even though it's tells it's pandemic, so certainly so during that time, and so I lost my train of thought now. We're talking about the funding.
The centralization of power, and why so many doctors have, failed to speak up.
Yeah. So, and then in initial stages and so on, there were so many scare stories about NHS staff died.
I remember.
They're literally scared. Pretty much all the overseas doctors, which is a large proportion of the health service, human resources, and so on, and they were completely redeployed away from patient-facing job and role completely. And now I think they're still really traumatized. A lot of them still truly feel that if they dare to come across anyone with perceived COVID-19, they would die.
I remember it was a 2-page spread, all the faces of the healthcare workers who had died on the front line. But then there was an expose that happened within a week or so, I think, that showed that I think less than 10% of them were actually actively working on the front line. So the story, I think 6 of them had retired. It's former healthcare workers. So it was just an early example, which actually I'd forgotten about. Thank you for reminding me of that. But there's been a whole series of those scare tactics throughout. And your point around the intrinsic link between the healthcare system and the state has also become apparent within the media, because just take this week, we've seen the front page of the front and back page of every major newspaper has seen an advertisement for the booster campaign. And there's the government has ploughed millions into advertising through the media over the last 2 years. And you could argue from a public health point of view that there is a need for public health messaging through the media, but the way in which this has happened, I think, is quite shocking. But nonetheless, there is that link then between the financial element that comes into play, where the government have literally spent millions on public health messaging through the newspapers, which means it puts the newspapers in a very difficult predicament, because if they are to come up with any critical stories, they're effectively insulting one of their highest paying funders, which from a business relationship point of view, radically shifts the impartiality between the newspaper and its sponsors, which it sounds very, very much obviously we have a public healthcare system in the UK. It's a different relationship, but it becomes very. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm reminded on a daily basis how politics and pandemics don't mix.
For a start, you don't bite the hands that feed. Okay, and that's just our survival instinct and so on. And then just going back to the fact that if politics plays medicine and so on, people come to harm and people die and so on. What they did is they commissioned Nightingale facility, underutilized by around about 1%. They commissioned track and trace, £37 billion. That's about a quarter of the NHS budget. And God knows how many hundreds of millions they spent on media campaign, biggest spender, and so on. And it's all very myopic, really, Dan. It's so myopic and short-sighted. I mean, biology is complex. Biology is wonderful. Biology is also what I call undifferentiated. It has such a wide range. And 2020, hey guys, that's it. Forget about everything else. That's all we're going to do now. And you wonder why the shit's hit the fan.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've spoken to hundreds of doctors in the last 2 years, and your story about being, having no patience is one that's replicated across the board. And if the anecdotes don't aren't enough for people, and you can just look at the data. I remember seeing 2 weeks after the lockdown an article, I think in the health the HSJ journal, which talked about how the hospitals were 40 to 60% of their usual capacity during the lockdown. And this is largely due, again, a political decision to shut down all of these major wards. So whilst the critical care units may still have been under pressure, or may not have been actually from some, it wasn't across the board, certainly not. But you saw GPs, hospitals really shutting out any form of appointments other than COVID. And I was talking to a cancer specialist this week who's been on the show, and we agreed that COVID has become the new big C, which over its lifetime will have a far well, it will be a pin drop compared to the number of deaths that we see year on year from cancer, which unfortunately we're going to see, I would imagine, a lot more cancer deaths in coming years due to the lack of treatment and diagnosis.
Yeah. Oh, it's not just cancer, Dan. I mean, the last around about last May 2020, when things got a little bit quieter, I was at the time thinking, oh, do you know what? In my naivety, I thought, you know what? We're going to come out of this. We're going to open up. We're going to go back to normal. We're going to do a bit of catching up. But no, that happened. It just went on and on and on. I was visiting people at home dying from heart attack and stroke in their late 40s.
Gosh.
Okay, so these are the people who are so scared. You literally walk in there and say, what happened? Oh, I got this chest pain a few days ago, and so now I can't breathe. So they didn't die from the heart attack, but they developed heart failure. Okay, and then it's treatable. It's still treatable. It's like, oh, look, things are going too far now. I can't treat you here. You need to go into that place or die of COVID. And this is not just one or two. This is consistent, absolutely consistent, happening again and again and again. And then I get to visit a lot of patients at home because their cancer treatment has been stopped, so they go straight to palliative care. I get late presentation of cancer because referrals did not happen. I mean, all these are not COVID related. These are policy-driven harms.
Well,
policy-driven harms.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, the lack of access to healthcare, the harms that you're speaking about, all policy-driven. I remember speaking to nurses in my local hospital asking about the wards, and it still hasn't made it into the media. It's still, even to this day, how the protocols that they were having to go through, precautionary protocols, which many of them agreed that some of them are necessary because of the situation. But a lot of them, in the same way that the public are frustrated with, or see are starting to see the flaws in the policy. The same is true in the hospitals. That they were the spacing between beds, the constant changing of PPE, and again, some of these things may or may not make sense. But nonetheless, that many of the doctors and nurses I spoke to said that the protocols, the pressures they were put under by policy, was causing more work pressures, and the pandemic and all of these things. That they're just causing a constant stream of people being off sick without being sick.
Yep, absolutely. So it's not just utilization of health service that changed drastically. It's actually the provision of health service and so on. We have all this, bed reductions happen because the policy needed spaces, and then the actual human resources able to supply the service also changed because lots of people are necessarily being excluded from providing care or service because policy and so on. So the workload needs to be done hasn't changed. The amounts of people who can do the work hasn't changed. So what's changed? Someone's been a very silly bugger around. And so that's I can go on. I can go on. And so throughout the summer months and so on, it was just most unusual that there's so many people came to harm and so on. And throughout the winter months, I remember around about September through to November, where we got that natural winter endemic peak and so on. And then the program, I shall not name the program, came in on the 9th of December. And 2 weeks later, the close to Christmas, then I call it the graveyard shift, where I go from nursing home to nursing home, trying to salvage those patients who dying on end-of-life care unnecessarily, in my view, anyway. So, even till this day, I don't know if you know this information or not. I just can't pin it down. There's a suspicion that vaccinated status and unvaccinated status are not quite as it seems. Unvaccinated status may remain the case up until 2 weeks after needle to skin time. That's what happens in America, and we tend to copy one another.
Yeah, I mean, I posted about this earlier this week from the ONS, similar guidelines from the ONS statistical points of view. There's lots of debate about how those statistics are being used and whether or not that is actually what's happened in practice. But certainly there is cause for suspicion. People are just disputing that, it makes sense on the basis that, but again, it's just the stories change to fit whatever narrative is required at the present moment, because at the outset, it was said that the reason why there needed to be spaces between doses is because it takes X amount of time for the antibody response to accumulate, and that the first 10 to 14 days, it takes time to start to kick in. Now that the story changes it takes much less time, that we needed to come in and get your next jab. But as a result, I remember seeing that spike very early on, and it's one of the. I was very quick to do a broadcast on that. I'd been watching the weekly mortality data in the ONS, and all of a sudden, there was this sudden shift in trajectory, because it started to tail off, and then suddenly a huge upward spike in the final weeks of the year. And I compared and contrasted it with the previous years, the previous 5 years, and it was abnormal. It was a very abnormal spike.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also,
I watched you very closely at the time, Dan, and I was there going, yes, come on, Dan, you need to get this information out, really, because people don't believe me.
And then I did another video where I compared the top 20 most vaccinated countries, and the same pattern occurring, which of course got censored and taken down from the internet. It also included anecdotal stories from people who had lost loved ones during that period of time. There's another story I've recalled recently from a friend of a family member who works in a care home, and they'd been very, very cautious during the entire year. They'd had no cases of COVID. They'd had no fatalities, of course. But then the moment this practice began in December, they had, within 2 weeks, 6 fatalities due to COVID in their care home, having had 0 cases, zero incidences, and then suddenly 6 fatalities. And when I shared that story originally, the amount of emails we got from other care homes, workers, care managers, was just shocking. I mean, I've got an inbox full of stories from that period of time. It's just devastating. But of course, when you try and share it, the critics come back and say you can't prove its causation, yada yada. But I actually spoke to a sage advisor confidentially. I can't say whose name it is, who they are, but they told me that the government had been preparing some public health messaging to coincide with the vaccination campaign, which would give not a warning, that's not the right word, but would state that the first 10 to 14 days of the jab, that people should be careful with their activity, because they could be at an increased risk of infection during that time. But they canned it on the basis that there was concerns that if people started self-isolating for 10 to 14 days post jab, that they would crash the economy. So they didn't proceed with that public health advice. But we can see it in all of the data. This post vaccination infections within the first couple of weeks, where clearly people their immune systems have waned. I find it just totally shocking how, again, it comes back down to the politicization of the pandemic.
Well, it's I'm lost for words on this, really, and it really is not about public health interests or best interests anymore, really. And so I'm not I'm not conspiratorial in any sense at all. But when you see what I see, you kind of think, Christ, what other poop are they going to dish out next?
Yes, I mean, in your 12 years plus of care, have you ever felt so forced to force patients into a treatment protocol or a medical practice, as we're witnessing now with the current campaign?
Well, I started my medical journey in '97 through med school and as a junior surgeon and through to general practice. And the common thread amongst all this undergrad and postgrad training is that you must put informed consent as a centerpiece to all your clinical care.
Mm. Mm.
You know, it's been drummed in and through and repeated again and again. You must make sure that you have patients' best interests. You must make sure that you have robust details and information to provide informed consent, which is basically what the treatment is for, what are the benefits, what are the risks. It doesn't matter how small it is, you have to declare it. What are the alternatives, and what if you do nothing about it? Okay, so these are the principle of informed consent and so on. So imagine that if I was in a practice and someone says, "Oh, by the way, I got this new treatment for osteoporosis, but we have no idea how it works or what the side effects or long-term data is and so on." I'm going to sit there and say, "No, bugger off! I'm not giving that to my patient because they're gonna come back and sue my ass if something goes wrong."
Yes.
Because that's what we do. When I perform a procedure or joint injection or minor surgery, I sit there and say, look, the benefit is that this would do this and that for you. My infection rate is around about 1%. If you do nothing, it's likely to progress or do nothing to you at all. And they can make a decision. None of that happened this year or last year. Full stop. I was a GP trainer and I teach very different clinicians. So I train nurse practitioners, nurses, clinical pharmacists, and paramedics, and clinical pharmacists, and so on. So quite a few different discipline, special clinicians. And then it's always the same. Really, say, look, guys, the way that how we treat, assess, or practice medicine is that you always find out the person's circumstances, unique circumstances, and you try and match the most appropriate treatment, ensuring that it fits their circumstances, and also ensuring that A, is in their best interest, and B, you always seek consent. You never ever allow a healthcare assistant to come along and give injection without some kind of prior approval. So every single time you get injection or a flu vaccination or any kind of injection in GP surgeries, they either need patient-specific directive or group directive to say that actually we thought about what the intention is, what the likely outcome, and so on, and then that will enter informed consent discussion. This year, nothing that happened. None of the vaccinator understand that actually this is still under emergency use authorization. None of them understand the benefit that's been quoted, relative benefit, and absolute relative risk reduction and absolute risk reduction. And none of them understand that there's only 2 months worth of data they're using, and none of them understood the mechanism of these new platforms.
Well, absolutely, and everything has been treated as a one-size-fits-all policy, and which takes pays no attention to underlying risk factors, particular patient cohorts. Each patient is treated as the same as the next. There's no discussion, and the risks, of course, in terms of the risk factors. The risk. All I see is newspaper headline after newspaper headline, story after story, publication after publication that focuses on the potential benefits. And again, even with the benefits now, you have to look at the funding behind the studies and who's driving these. I personally have lost all faith in the medical system, the scientific system. We'll come on to talk about the present and the future, the future of healthcare. But at least on a personal level, one of the benefits, it's also a cost, is that now I feel more empowered than ever before to make my own medical choices, because I'm acutely aware of the biases and the problems that come with the pharmaceutical industry. that said, now my trust, there is a huge cost of a loss of trust in authority, a huge cost in loss of trust in the medical system and the scientific system, and plus, whilst I'm a reasonably intelligent human being, I'm not qualified to make medical decisions, but I am very capable of reading scientific literature. And I've taught myself so much so, and I've surrounded myself with hundreds of doctors, but not everyone has that privilege. But so it comes at a great cost that this trust has been lost. So I'm keen to hear your perspectives on what the future could look like, because undoubtedly from here, I know I'm not alone in losing trust in the healthcare system, the science behind it. Become deeply skeptical of the conflicts of interests, which puts us in a place of vulnerability. But I also see it as an exciting possibility for the future, where we can start to build more effective healthcare systems. So what do you think the future looks like? Is there a message of hope that you can share?
Well, Dan, there's always hope. Humanity has always operated and existed on the premise of hope and so on. So, I see plenty of silver lining in all this and so on. It's just unfortunate that we have to get to such a horrible, horrible state of being in order for a lot of us to realize that actually we need to change. It's no longer about, I've got a problem, it's your problem to sort it out for me. Okay, now I think a large unhealthy cohort of the population has realized that now we lost trust in the system, and now we start to realize that it's more self-interest and best interest at hand here, and we start to seek out perhaps a different way of doing things, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I don't know how long it's going to take to get there, but we'll get there eventually, as we have done through the millennia and so on. So I have plenty of hope. I mean, a lot of what I'm doing at this stage, Dan, is I help those people who has now shifted their mentality from I'm helpless. Can you please help me to actually I want you to help me now because I'm going to take charge. And that's great because I can get the message across to the principles of functional medicine about how to use nutrition, how to use the environmental and manipulation, how to use psychological techniques to improve our general well-being, because that's a lot more powerful than I believe it's more powerful than just giving pills.
Okay. Well, yes, I'm very curious to learn more about this from your perspective, about how people can use the principles of functional medicine to enhance their well-being.
Sure. I mean, let's move on to that, Dan, because I suppose that's the important bit now. And now I had a good old rant. I feel better. All this is off my chest. So let's look at what's important now. Okay. So, in my view, a well-being is not simply disease-free. Dan. I mean, there are four really important pillars, in my view, that support the person's well-being. The first one is that it needs to be for good physical health. The second pillar is that it needs to be in decent and adequate wealth, whether materialistic or spiritual. Okay, some of the happiest people don't have a lot of possessions, but they're very wealthy in mind. And you also need a purpose, because without purpose, existence is meaningless. And the fourth one is that you must have a community, because we evolved as a tribal creature and we can't survive without our tribe. So community is important. So it's really by concentration on those four important pillars that will allow us to thrive as an individual, and which will allow us to thrive as a piece within a group and community, dependently, interdependently, and codependently. Okay, so based on that, the principle of functional medicine comes in quite handy, really, because it starts to recognize actually, modern living is rather detrimental to our biology. Okay, and then the last 40 years has seen an explosion in all sorts of diseases, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and so on. Technology is very good at keeping us alive, but it doesn't actually keep us any healthier. Okay, so the principle now is looking back, all the way back to our evolutionary biology journey, and to look at what is it that help us evolve to such an extent as a Homo sapien with optimal health. And then if you look back and so on, it's not actually very difficult, really. So we didn't eat grain that much. We didn't eat refined sugar. We didn't eat all this manufactured frankenfood. We didn't eat all this manufactured oil from petroleum business. Okay, we as Homo sapien basically lived in a tribe. We hunted, we ate when we got food. When we don't have food, we don't eat. So we don't need regular meals to thrive. Every time you eat, your immune system has to deal with it. Okay, and then we live with nature. We need to get dirty, down dirty with nature in order to thrive. There are 3 times more microbes and bugs on you than your human cells. Okay, there's roughly around about 30 trillion body cells, but there's more than 100 trillion microbes on you and me individually. That's a huge number. It's unfathomable how much of us is actually down to the environment and so on. And yeah, hey, guess what? Hand wash, sanitation, kill the buggers. You kill the buggers, you kill yourself. It's like what you like is kill yourself or cause yourself some serious harm. Okay, and then so and then when we were in that tribal or community structure and so on, we went to bed when the sun went down. We got up when the sun rise. We didn't just do night shift. We didn't have the visual light disrupting our circadian rhythm and hormonal control. Okay, and then we so can you understand how that's our biology, how we evolved, is so different to how we live now, and you wonder why people got sick. You still there, Dan? Hi, Dan. I lost it. I lost you just now.
Yeah, lost me real quickly. I've got you. I lost you very briefly, but you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of we can look to our ancestry, we can look to nature for answers. I believe, and
Yep.
my concern is we came to this conversation to kind of give a view from the front line and talk about the past, the present, and the future. But we're at this point now where I just feel we are on a pathway to the over medicalization of humanity, where every problem has an equal or equivalent medical intervention, and that we are. I mean, I just saw a video circulating today. I mean, people called this conspiracy theory last year, but it's new breakthroughs in how healthcare surveillance, which includes very small microchips in pills inside of the different types of medical intervention, whether it's injections or pills, the different ways we consume medical, in order to track people's consumption of these healthcare interventions. This digital surveillance overlaid with this over medicalization of society. It just feels like we're going to be one drugged up society within the next decade, and that we'll be trying to take a vaccine to prevent every form of illness. We'll be using medical intervention to treat mental, emotional, physical problems. I mean, I'm not. But where do you think what path do you think we'll end up on? And what can we do to carve an alternative path?
Sure. I mean, that's some very good point here. Really, I mean, I'm gonna sort of support that a bit more by paraphrasing it and so on. So I think humankind has this audacity and arrogance to think that we are more intelligent and more powerful than Mother Nature. That's the real issue here. In that, every single change that we make to ourselves and so on is going to take a few hundred years before before our biology can eventually adapt. Okay, so currently there's a very clear trend in that healthcare is no longer healthcare. It's more industry now, that in my view, and so on. It creates a disease. And then once you create a disease that's recognized and so on, you have this ongoing subscription of treatments, medication, and so on. You become a life addict to it. Literally, a lot of us are just druggies. We're so addicted and dependent on that. So we're kind of at this juncture where we need to diversify now, really. So currently, the direction is that the mainstream or the orthodoxy is taking us down this route of artificial and forced human evolution. Okay, we have a choice to digress into more natural and closer to our natural human evolutionary biology. And basically, what that means is that the least amount of man-made artificial intervention as possible, and then we need to realign ourselves to more to cleaner eating. Basically, anything that has more than 1 or 2 ingredients is processed. Leave it. Don't touch it. It's not rocket science, you know. You just need to get people to be find someone so you can be accountable for your action. Okay. And then I think at this stage that the awakening process of what's going on here means that a lot of us will start to gravitate towards this more as what biologically aligned service. You no longer just rely on diagnosis and so on. I think at some stage that we will go beyond fear into actually coming out, taking action, and actually being compassionate and kind and start living again. Currently, this is no life. Most of us are just constantly under threat just to survive. Can't even get our head above the parapet or even to take a breather. That's my belief of where that we need to go. And there's certainly a lot of motivation and energy and also a lot of efforts put into setting up more kind of a holistic or whole person based type of service. And then they're coming together, they're working together, they're collaborating together to form the infrastructure or network and so on. So it wouldn't surprise me that over the next 6 to 12 months and so on, we have a credible and tangible system rivaling the NHS that actually is drilling down to the underlying fundamental root issue of our ill health. I mean, fair enough that there are lots of people currently in the system and so on are suffering and likely to come to their demise prematurely and so on because the policy changes and so on. I know this is going to sound really cruel, but in biology, this certain proportion of the population will come to harm and demise naturally. And our job now is ensuring that we don't get into this hamster wheel and believing that we can save everyone. It's not about saving everyone now. It's about ensuring that we live our life according to biology, and we practice compassion and kindness. We start to do the right things.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you made an important point. What I came to an understanding the other day, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have the physiological needs at the baseline: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction. Next layer up: safety needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, property, somewhere to live. Before moving up to love and belongings, and then esteem and self-actualization.
That's right.
It made me realize how many people have actually through the last 2 years have been taken where they were making their way up through to esteem and self-actualization, or at least at the love and belonging level, but have been plummeted back to where they feel their physiological needs are threatened, their safety needs are threatened, based upon this situation. So people have kind of gone back to this lower level of human needs as a result of what they've gone through. And as a result, but also you've seen how policy has taken us out of love and belonging. It's taken us, we've seen divide and conquer in the media. People's sense of connection has been broken with family and friends because of the politicization and moralization of what we've gone through. It's been deeply harmful on so many levels. And the piece you mentioned there, 4 components, you talked about purpose. Well, one of my favorite guests that I've had on recently is Professor Matthias Desmet, and he talked about how background anxiety and lack of meaning and purpose are 2 of the fundamental drivers of why this authoritarian approach to governance has been able to rise, because people have attached their background anxiety to the virus. They've attached their lack of meaning or purpose to the greater good of mask wearing, sanitization, following all these policies and big, it's not. I don't want to be judgmental, but being righteous or virtue signaling around that behavior as a way of garnering meaning, but it becomes a reflection for the lack of meaning they have in their day-to-day lives. But we see this across the spectrum, including across the politicians. Which is why this is still going on. Really, people aren't letting go of control because it's giving them meaning, but it's a false sense of meaning. And I think you absolutely nailed the head. You hit the nail on the head that that's such an element, belonging, as an element of well-being, but also that purpose and finding that inner purpose and that sense of meaning.
I've got an analogy that most people dislike, but I do think that it's a very honest and a more reflective analogy. Dan, so our human psyche, our human psychology, or how our human neurology has two parts. We have our neocortical logical brain, and we have our basic brain, which is sort of primate and mammalian and so on in nature. And so in some ways that we can perhaps look at what's happening now to chimpanzee in society. Okay, because once you take away the ability to access logic, and we revert back to our primate and so on. So what happens in primate society? You have an alpha male, the authoritative and paternalistic figure, and you have a ring. You have the goons around the alpha male, which dish out all the instruction. And you have the rest of the society or the group that's complying. It's not really for the greater good. It's just because they need to, otherwise they won't survive. If you sort of reflect that to what's happening now, everyone's going, oh yeah, it is for greater good and so on. No, mate. It's not about greater good. You feel under threat. You are fearful. You're looking for the authoritative alpha male, okay, just so you survive, because our innate biological need is survival and passing our genetic material to the next generation. Okay, don't pretend it's about, it's for the greater good. It is for the greater good because you're part of that survival group. You're not using your logic at all, mate. So don't insult anyone saying it's for the greater good. If it was for the greater good, you start to use your logical brain to work out, actually, we're no longer chimpanzees, we're Homo sapien. Okay, Homo sapien use our logic and use logic to work out imaginative ways to make our community work better. That's why we have compassion. That's why we have kindness, and so on. And so in some ways, that I'm not justifying what's happening at this stage, because what's happening to the world is just so profoundly representative of our primate instinct. I've just insulted about millions of people here, haven't I? So my apologies. I'm sorry. Oh, I lost you there, Dan. So if the listeners...
No, I can still hear you. I'm here. I lost you.
Okay, you're back now.
We lost the connection very briefly there. It's I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I think we and a great analogy of the situation we find ourselves in, and it just feels like this. Yeah, one of my favorite. I was sat on the train on the way to London. Going to the protest at the weekend, and sorry, I'm just having some connection problems. I don't know what the issue is here. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dan. Yeah,
you can hear me. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sat on the train, no mask, and this sea of it felt like a sea of sadness, a sea of sameness, and it reminded me of the phrase that been suppressed so intensely throughout this period that we've lost that element of compassion, that element of drive and meaning and courage that comes with being human. And I wonder what it will take to kind of awaken that again, because it just feels like people's emotions are suppressed. It just feels like people are down and
I
out,
lost.
and you know, you lost me there again,
Sorry,
did you?
I lost you there again. And so, in some ways, that's we can probably use some psychological modeling to predict what's going to happen. Then, I mean, predictably, that's what tends to happen. Is that we go through 4 different phases. In the first phase, that something's happened to us, we become downhearted. Things are not good enough. And then we'll go through the next phase where that's the suppression or the adversity is so bad, we reach a stage where that we feel we had enough. And only until you reach that peak, I had enough, and so on, that becomes the trigger for insight and action. Okay. And then after that action takes place, you either become active to solve the problem, or you become inactive and eliminate it, and so on. So I do believe that we're at this precipice where that's a lot of people had enough and at that verge of taking action. And then once we start to take action, we can effect the changes that we need, we want to see, and so on. So, I have plenty of hope and optimism in that, even though that's, a lot of us are perceived or are viewed as, surviving or existing in a fringe of society. But then again, most things that change history or change humanity behavior are usually around the fringe and the minority. So actually, I'm optimistic. So it sounds like I'm doing a bit of monologue here because Dan has just disappeared. And so in that case, I'll carry on talking and so on, as long as that the listeners are happy to do so. So what does that mean then in my personal view and so on? I mean, certainly that at this stage, I believe that we need to use this adversity, and now we develop our sense of purpose. And a lot of our sense of purpose is fighting for justice and community again now. And this is probably the most important driver to rebuild our community back in again, really. So in the community where that's those like-minded or more principle-aligned individuals come together, and we start to oust all this corporate corruptive behavior, and then start to say, hey guys, look, the sensible thing to do is that rather than having this vertical integration of dependency, the right thing to do is horizontal inter and codependency. So we never get to the stage where that's one person holds all the power and all this corporate corrupt behavior and vested interests and so on. I can go on. Okay, so it's a great opportunity to do so. And then most things start small and they start to build, and as momentum gathers and so on, it compounds on previous efforts. So I'm very optimistic that there's so many different efforts out there. There's so many different endeavors. People talking about health centers, people talking about alternative banking system, people talking about building a new country, people talking about building gated community and so on. All this are based on the same principle. In that, when your principles and values align, you work better, and so on. You basically tell all those silly buggers, come on, piss off, and so on. Remember, they are few, we are many.
Indeed. Thank you, Peter. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've seen some great comments throughout this conversation. Apologies for the connection issues there at the end here. And I know people will be curious. You're someone that's commenting and sharing a lot on this across the breadth of the pandemic. And it's important that people can connect with you. So you're active primarily on Facebook at this moment in time. Isn't that right, Peter? If people want to follow you and...
Yeah. So with you, I'm very active on Facebook and so on. I'm surprised I haven't been censored yet. Probably because I don't use the V word.
Yes. You have to. I think we're all learning how to navigate the boundaries of what's acceptable and finding a way around it, which is keeping the conversation alive, which is really important. So I think for those people watching, if you're watching on live on Facebook, I'll make sure we'll tag Peter into the conversation so you can see his channel. And if you're on YouTube or Twitter or Odyssey watching this, we'll also put the links to Peter's channel so that you can stay in touch.
Thank you, appreciate that. And I also got a website, Dan. My website is called principleventurehealthservice.org.uk, so PVHS. I'll send you the link. And within that page, I also have and within that, with sites, there's a page dedicated to whole person health service. And really, it's about this is my endeavor as my purpose. in life. I believe that my calling now is coordinating and supporting the setup of non-discriminatory and ethical practices. Whether that's health service, whether it's care, whether it's building communities, whether it's about development and so on. So I'm coordinating with very different groups at this stage. So if listeners are interested and feel that this is something that they feel really strongly about, would like to participate and contribute, come to my page www.pvhs.org.uk and then just choose the page Whole Person Health Service.
Fantastic. We'll put the link in the comments as well here in the descriptions for people to check that out. That's a fantastic initiative, and we'd love to learn more about this as we move forward. We're about to launch a community program of our own for the podcast in the new year, and we want to create spaces for people like yourself to come and share their work, so that our audience can find how to get involved with these types of things. Because I see two streams of work right now. Well, three really. One is resisting what is happening at scale. The other is looking to reimagine the future or reinvent the future, and looking at how we move forward from here. And the third is really somewhat of a spiritual and personal awakening. I think that's all part of the journey that we're going on. I've just shared the link in the comments there just now, but to the pvhs.org.uk website. For people to check out. But Peter, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show tonight. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot here tonight in looking at the observations from the front line, but also your fascinating views on functional health and how we can move forward from here. So it's been an honor and a pleasure having you here on our live broadcast this evening.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for having me, and I really enjoy that. I hope our listeners also benefit from the conversation. And when people contact me, I might not reply straight away, but I will endeavor always to reply. So I'm sorry, my advance apology for delaying communication, guys. And I'm working 7 days a week at the moment, and so on. So yes, once I catch up some sleep, I'll get onto the admin bit.
No, the feeling. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. Thank you. And for the listeners, if you're new to the show tonight, you can subscribe to our newsletter at danjgregory.com/pandemic. That's danjgregory.com/pandemic. Again, the links will be after the broadcast in the comments. Where you'll be able to hear about our forthcoming interviews and our brand new community program that's coming out in the new year. We've also got a Telegram channel, which you can find on Telegram. If you look for Pandemic Podcast UK, you'll see the logo and you'll see our podcasts, and you'll also be able to join in the discussion after the episodes about your takeaways from the sessions that we've covered. So thank you to everyone who's watched us live and shared this broadcast. Thank you again to Peter. And this may or may not be our last broadcast before the Christmas period. I'm sure I'll do one more before we go off to the Christmas break, but certainly our last interview until the new year. So thank you so much to Peter for being here tonight, and thank you to all of you at home. Have a wonderful evening, and see you again very soon on the Pandemic Podcast.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.